Tonight, we journey back to a year when the sun disappeared, crops withered, and the world shivered under strange, cold skies. This is the story of the year without a summer, a global disaster triggered by a single eruption, reshaping nations, inspiring legends, and reminding humanity of its fragile place on Earth. Before we dive into this incredible chapter of history, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let us know where you're watching from. Your support helps us keep bringing forgotten stories to life. Now settle in, get comfortable, and let's uncover the true story behind the summer that never came. In the early spring of 1815, as the world slowly moved past the Napoleonic Wars, most people were looking forward to the familiar rhythms of planting, harvest, and healing. But on a small island half a world away, something unimaginable was about to unfold, something that would ripple across the globe, darkening skies, twisting seasons, and changing human history in ways no one could have foreseen. The island was Sumbawa, part of what we now call Indonesia. And the mountain at its center, Mount Tambora, had been silent for centuries. Towering more than 14,000 feet into the sky, it loomed over the island, a brooding presence shrouded in clouds. Then, in April of 1815, the mountain stirred. At first, the signs were small, strange rumblings, thin plumes of smoke rising from the summit, animals growing restless. Villagers living on Tambora's slopes looked up nervously but carried on with their lives. But the signs grew stronger, louder explosions that rattled windows, rivers turning muddy and warm, ash falling like black snow. On the evening of April 5th, a massive eruption shook the island, lighting up the night sky with fire and ash. Villagers as far away as Java, over 800 miles distant, heard the explosions, mistaking them for cannon fire. Still, no one could have predicted what came next. On April 10th, Mount Tambora unleashed its fury. It was one of the most powerful volcanic eruptions in recorded history, at least 100 times more powerful than the eruption of Mount St. Helens in 1980. The mountain's peak blew apart with a deafening roar, sending a column of ash and gas more than 25 miles into the atmosphere. Pyroclastic flows, superheated avalanches of gas, ash, and rock, raced down the mountain at terrifying speeds, incinerating everything in their path. Villages at the foot of Tambora were buried instantly, erased from the earth in a matter of moments. The darkness was immediate. Ash rained down like black powder. The midday sky turned to night. Birds dropped from the air. Crops withered under the weight of falling dust. The sea itself boiled near the shores, and tsunamis smashed into neighboring islands. Tens of thousands of people died in the immediate aftermath, either from the blast itself or from starvation and disease that followed. Entire communities vanished without a trace. But Tambora's destruction didn't stop at Sumbawa's shores. The eruption had hurled millions of tons of ash, dust, and sulfur dioxide into the upper atmosphere. There, these particles would spread across the globe, forming a thin, sun-reflecting veil around the planet, a veil that would dim the sun's warmth, disrupt weather patterns, and trigger famine, migration, and despair across continents. The world didn't know it yet, but the year without a summer had begun. And from the rice paddies of Asia to the farms of New England, to the darkened skies of Europe, no one would be spared from the strange, haunting shadow cast by a mountain few had even heard of. The roar of Tambora was more than an explosion. It was a signal that nature, in all its fury, could reach across oceans, across kingdoms and empires, to remind humanity just how fragile their world truly was. And soon, the seasons themselves would betray those who had trusted in their rhythm. Nothing, not the crops, not the weather, not the very air, would ever be quite the same again. In the weeks following the eruption of Mount Tambora, the world began to change, subtly at first, almost invisibly, as if nature itself were holding its breath. The sky over Sumbawa remained dark for days, thick with ash and smoke. Ships passing through the nearby seas reported sailing under a blood-red sun, navigating by dead reckoning because the stars were blotted out. But the real journey of Tambora's ash had only just begun. Carried by powerful stratospheric winds, the fine particles of ash and sulfur dioxide began to spread across the globe. First to nearby islands. then across the Indian Ocean. Then, in swirling streams high above the earth, they drifted westward, toward Africa, the Middle East, Europe, and eventually, the Americas. At ground level, most people noticed little at first. In India, monsoon rains came later than usual. In China, strange frosts appeared during what should have been the planting season. In Europe, brilliant sunsets dazzled the sky, breathtaking displays of crimson and purple and gold that artists tried feverishly to capture on canvas. But behind the beauty was something far more dangerous. The volcanic veil in the upper atmosphere acted like a massive sunshade, reflecting sunlight away from the Earth's surface. Temperatures began to drop, not dramatically at first, but consistently, insidiously. And the seasons, so carefully relied upon for survival, began to shift and falter. In the summer of 1815, farmers across Europe found their crops growing strangely. Wheat struggled in the cooler temperatures. Vines yielded sickly, sour grapes. Vegetables rotted in the fields. By autumn, the whispers of concern grew louder. Merchants spoke of reduced harvests. Grain prices edged higher. Peasants grumbled in market squares. And yet no one could see the storm that was gathering, a storm of hunger, fear, and unrest. Across the Atlantic, in North America, similar omens began to appear. New England, usually vibrant with summer warmth, suffered unusual cold spells even in July. Frost crept across fields in the night, killing young corn and wilting tender shoots. Still, most people believed it was just an odd season, a fluke. After all, weather could be unpredictable. But Tamboura's ash cloud wasn't just causing a bad harvest or a few cold nights. It was fundamentally altering the planet's climate. In ways no one yet understood, Tamboura's eruption had set the stage for a global catastrophe, one that would unfold not in fiery explosions, but in failed crops, empty granaries, and desperate migrations. The poorest would suffer first, and then the middle classes. And soon, even the wealthy would realize that no fortune, no palace, no privilege could stand against a world where the sun itself had dimmed. The ash rode the wind silently, invisibly, a ghostly reminder of a mountain's fury. And as it circled the globe, it planted the seeds of a bitter harvest that would leave millions hungry, hopeless, and searching for answers. In the distant sky, sunsets still burned with impossible beauty. But on the ground, the first cracks were beginning to show. And the worst was still to come. By the spring of 1816, strange weather had become the new normal. Across the northern hemisphere, the world awoke to cold rains, gray skies, and an unsettling feeling that something had shifted. Winter had barely loosened its grip. Snow still clung to fields in places where it should have melted weeks earlier. Farmers shook their heads and waited, trusting that the warmth would soon return. But it didn't. In New England, April was colder than anyone could remember. May brought frosts that killed tender sprouts almost as soon as they emerged. And then came June, a month when the sun should have been high and warm. But instead, on the morning of June 6th, snow fell across much of the northeastern United States. Snow. In June. It blanketed fields of young corn, flattened gardens, and coated the rooftops of houses not built to withstand such confusion. Livestock huddled together for warmth. Birds, caught off guard, died in droves, their stiff bodies littering the fields. Farmers tried to replant, desperate to salvage some sort of harvest. But the soil remained stubbornly cold. More frosts followed, often sudden and devastating, striking in the middle of the night without warning. By mid-June, it was clear, this was no ordinary year. The newspapers called it the year without a summer, though no one yet knew how far-reaching the disaster would become. In Europe, things were no better. In France and Switzerland, heavy rains ruined the wheat fields. Rivers overflowed, flooding towns and villages. In England, damp, chilly conditions stunted the grain and rotted the potatoes. Even in parts of China, farmers battled unseasonable cold and wetness, leading to crop failures and soaring food prices. Across the globe, the traditional rhythms of life, planting, growing, harvesting, were thrown into chaos. No one could predict when the next frost would strike. No one could rely on the rains arriving when they were needed. No one could be certain that the sun, hidden behind a dull, leaden sky, would shine again in time to save the season. Communities turned inward, hoarding what food they could. Grain prices skyrocketed, sometimes quadrupling in a matter of months. In the countryside, families faced starvation. In cities, the poor lined up outside bakeries and markets, hoping for bread they could no longer afford. And beneath it all was a growing, gnawing fear, not just of hunger, but of something deeper. What had caused this? Was it divine punishment? Some spoke of angry gods or apocalyptic omens. Others blamed sunspots, or a shift in the Earth's orbit, or even volcanic activity, though few yet connected the dots back to the distant eruption of Mount Tambora. What they did know was this: the world they had trusted, the seasons, the harvest, the sun, had betrayed them. And the betrayal was only just beginning. Throughout the summer of 1816, as the fields withered and the markets emptied, despair deepened. And soon, it would spark waves of migration, riots, and even the birth of new stories and legends that would echo down through history. Because when the sun disappears and the earth grows cold, people must find new ways to survive, or new meanings for their suffering. The year without a summer wasn't just a season. It was the start of a global reckoning. As the cold grip of 1816 tightened, hunger spread like a second, invisible plague. In the United States, farmers watched helplessly as their fields failed them. Corn, the backbone of rural New England's economy, withered in the cold. Wheat and oats grew thin and spindly. Vegetables rotted in waterlogged soil or were killed by sudden frosts. In Vermont, entire communities faced ruin. Families who had scratched a living from the rocky soil for generations packed their belongings into wagons and left, seeking better land in Ohio, Indiana, and beyond. The year without a summer triggered one of the earliest mass migrations in American history. Pioneers moved westward not just for adventure or opportunity, but because they had no choice. The land that had sustained them no longer obeyed the seasons they trusted. In Europe, famine gripped the countryside even harder. In Switzerland, crops failed on a catastrophic scale. Peasants scoured the forests for wild roots and leaves to stave off starvation. In Ireland, already accustomed to hardship, the potato fields turned to black mush under relentless rain. In Germany, grain prices soared so high that even middle-class families struggled to afford bread. Riots broke out in towns across Europe. In England, desperate workers smashed bakeries and stole whatever food they could find. In France, grain convoys were attacked by starving peasants who had nothing left to lose. In Italy, mobs raided storehouses and looted markets. The social order, already fragile after years of war and upheaval, strained under the weight of widespread hunger. Disease followed famine like a shadow. In weakened, malnourished populations, typhus spread rapidly through rural villages and crowded cities alike. In parts of Ireland and Scotland, entire families perished, not from the cold itself, but from the sickness and hunger that followed in its wake. Across the Atlantic, American towns and cities saw similar scenes. Children begged for scraps in the streets. Parents went without meals to feed the young. Stories circulated of desperate men stealing from their neighbors, of churches organizing charity drives to keep families alive through the bitter summer. It was not a sudden collapse. It was a slow, grinding erosion of security, a relentless squeezing of hope. And yet, even amid the suffering, people adapted. In Vermont, a young boy named Joseph Smith, whose family struggled through the cold summer, would later claim visions that led to the founding of a new faith, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. In Europe, scientists began asking deeper questions about the natural world. Was this simply bad luck? Or were there larger forces at work, forces humanity had yet to understand? Slowly, a few scholars pieced together theories about volcanoes and atmospheric changes, though they lacked the technology to fully prove what we know today, that Mount Tambora's eruption had dimmed the entire world. But for the farmers plowing ruined fields, for the mothers stirring empty pots over meager fires, and for the children staring hungrily at barren gardens, those explanations came too late. They needed food. They needed warmth. They needed a summer that would not come. The year without a summer wasn't just a weather event. It was a test of endurance, of community, and of humanity's ability to find a way through the darkest of seasons. And as the cold months wore on, some would survive. Others would not. But all would remember the year the sun failed them. While famine and fear gripped much of the world in 1816, on the shores of Lake Geneva, something strange and unexpected was happening, something that would echo not in politics or agriculture, but in the imagination. That summer, a group of travelers, poets, writers, and dreamers, gathered at the Villa Diodati, a grand house perched above the grey waters of the lake. Among them were Lord Byron, the infamous and charismatic British poet, Percy Bysshe Shelley, a rising star of radical poetry, his companion Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, soon to become Mary Shelley, and a few others drawn to the circle of literature, rebellion, and romance. They had come seeking the beauty of the Swiss summer. But they found only gloom. The skies remained heavy and low, clouds swirling endlessly over the lake. Cold rain poured down for days at a time, trapping the guests inside. Thunder rumbled across the mountains. The world outside seemed muted, dreamlike, almost post-apocalyptic. The endless grayness seeped into their minds. To pass the time, the group read ghost stories aloud by candlelight, trying to outdo one another with tales of horror and mystery. Eventually, Byron proposed the challenge. Each of them should write their own ghost story, something truly frightening. Thus began one of the most famous nights in literary history. Mary Shelley, only 18 at the time, struggled at first. But one night, after a vivid and terrifying dream, she began to write the story that would become Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus. In her dream, she saw a scientist kneeling beside a horrifying creature he had assembled, a man stitched together from corpses, animated by some dark force. It was a vision of unnatural creation, of science overreaching its bounds, a fitting nightmare for a world where nature itself seemed to have gone mad. Frankenstein would become a cornerstone of modern horror and science fiction, exploring themes of ambition, creation, and unintended consequences. Its shadow still stretches across literature, film, and culture to this day. Meanwhile, Lord Byron, inspired by the same dismal summer, wrote the eerie poem, Darkness, a chilling meditation on a world where the sun has died, humanity falls into chaos, and nature collapses into ash and ruin. I had a dream, which was not all a dream, he wrote. The bright sun was extinguished. It was no dream for the people outside Villa Diodati. The world really was darker, colder, more desperate. But inside the villa, the strange summer birthed a new kind of storytelling, darker, more introspective, wrestling with the thin line between human ambition and nature's unpredictable wrath. The cold, wet, miserable summer of 1816 didn't just scar the fields and empty the granaries. It also reshaped the human imagination. In a world stripped of its familiar seasons, people began to confront new fears about technology, about nature, about the fragility of human progress. Out of the mists of Lake Geneva, out of the thunderclouds that refused to lift, came monsters, nightmares, and new ways of thinking that would ripple through the next 2 centuries. The year without a summer was not only a season of hardship. It was a season that gave birth to legends. By late 1816, the effects of the missing summer had deepened into full-blown catastrophe across much of the world. In Europe, especially, the collapse of agriculture triggered something more dangerous than simple hunger: social unrest. In cities across Germany, France, and Switzerland, desperate crowds gathered outside bakeries and markets. Bread prices had doubled, tripled, in some places, quadrupled. The poor, already battered by years of war and taxation, found themselves facing a cruel choice: starve quietly, or rise up. Many chose the latter. Food riots exploded in dozens of towns. In Zurich, mobs stormed warehouses, seizing grain and flour. In England, angry crowds attacked grain convoys moving through the countryside, desperate to steal shipments before they reached the markets where prices were beyond reach. In France, peasants armed with sticks and stones looted farms and bakeries, some shouting for a new revolution. The governments, already strained and mistrusted after the Napoleonic Wars, responded harshly. Troops were deployed. Riots were broken up with sabers and musket fire. Markets were guarded like fortresses. But force could not solve the underlying problem. There simply wasn't enough food. And it wasn't just the poor who suffered. In England, small farmers and artisans, once comfortably above starvation, found themselves selling furniture, tools, even family heirlooms just to buy a sack of grain. In Ireland, tenant farmers, dependent almost entirely on potatoes, saw their crops rot in the wet fields. Evictions soared. Whole families wandered the roads in search of work or charity. Some cities tried to organize relief. Soup kitchens were established in parts of Germany and Britain. Charitable societies distributed bread, sometimes mixed with sawdust to stretch it further. But these were bandages on a wound that kept growing. And the psychological impact was just as devastating as the physical. For centuries, farmers had trusted the seasons. They planted by the stars, harvested by the moon, confident in the cycle of sowing and reaping. Now, all that was shattered. Frost could come at any time. Rains could drown a field overnight. The sun might not appear for weeks. The world had become unpredictable. Some turned to religion, believing that the strange weather was a punishment for human sins. Church attendance rose in many areas, sermons filled with warnings of apocalypse and repentance. Others blamed political leaders, scientists, foreigners, anyone who could be made a scapegoat for a disaster that had no clear human cause. Still others simply gave up. Suicides rose. Whole villages were abandoned. People fled cities like Paris, London, and Berlin, hoping that somewhere, anywhere, the sun still shone and crops still grew. But there was no escape. From the rice fields of China to the wheat fields of Germany to the cornfields of Vermont, the hand of Tambora reached invisibly, relentlessly, across oceans and continents. It was a disaster without walls or borders. A reminder that nature, indifferent and vast, could unite humanity in suffering as easily as in celebration. The year without a summer dragged on. And with each passing month, the hope that next season might be better grew fainter. The world waited, hungry and uncertain, for the return of the sun. While Europe and North America reeled from hunger and unrest, the effects of Tambora's eruption rippled across Asia as well, bringing devastation to lands thousands of miles from the shattered mountain. In India, the monsoon rains, vital for the crops that fed millions, arrived late and erratic. The usual rhythm of planting and harvesting broke apart. Drought gripped large regions. Crops failed. Famine loomed. Then, when the rains did come, they came all at once. Floodwaters swept through villages, drowning fields and washing away grain stores. The combination of drought and flood created a perfect storm for another, even deadlier enemy: cholera. Weakened and malnourished populations became easy prey for the disease. The first major cholera pandemic erupted from the Ganges Delta in 1817, sweeping outward to devastate not just India but eventually parts of China, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and even Europe. It was a chain reaction no one could have foreseen. One volcano, one eruption, set off a sequence of starvation, migration, and disease that would reshape human history far beyond the ash-covered villages of Sumbawa. In China, the weather patterns also faltered. Unseasonable cold destroyed rice harvests in Yunnan province. Snow reportedly fell in the middle of the summer. As food supplies dwindled, famine took hold. Some families were forced to sell possessions, homes, and eventually even their own children to survive. Throughout Southeast Asia, the skies remained dim, the seasons confused. The great empires and kingdoms of the region were not blind to the suffering, but their resources were stretched thin. Trade routes faltered. Port cities struggled as goods slowed to a trickle. Rice, normally abundant, became a precious commodity, hoarded, fought over, and, at times, stolen at sword point. Yet, amid the darkness, there were stories of resilience too. Communities organized food sharing. Temples opened their gates to the starving. Caravans and ships braved dangerous seas to bring what little food could be spared to isolated regions. Still, for much of the world, 1816 and the years immediately following became a long, slow disaster, a tapestry of local tragedies woven into a global catastrophe. Most people had no idea that the cause of their suffering, the cold, the hunger, the disease, could be traced back to a mountain explosion half a world away. Tambora was a phantom enemy. Invisible. Distant. Yet terrifyingly real in its consequences. And even as 1816 gave way to 1817, the effects did not simply vanish. Famine would persist for years in some regions. Economic depression would cripple entire countries. The scars, physical, cultural, and psychological, would remain for generations. A single eruption had shown how interconnected the world truly was, even in an age before telegraphs and airplanes. Nature, with one thunderous blast, had drawn a line across human history, separating a world that trusted in the cycles of sun and season from a world that knew how easily, how suddenly, it could all fall apart. And while the skies would eventually clear and the crops would grow again, the world after Tambora would not be the same as the world before. The year without a summer was ending. But its legacy was only just beginning. As 1817 dawned, hope began to flicker, but faintly, like a candle guttering in the wind. In parts of the northern hemisphere, the cold finally loosened its grip. The sun returned, timid and pale, and the first green shoots of spring appeared. But the world Tambora had reshaped could not recover overnight. The scars of the year without a summer ran deep. In New England, farmers who had managed to survive the failed harvest found themselves starting over from nothing. Many had eaten their seed grain just to stay alive, leaving them with nothing to plant. Others had sold off land, livestock, and tools to pay for what little food they could find. Entire towns emptied as families packed up and moved westward, seeking more fertile land and better fortunes beyond the Appalachian Mountains. It was a wave of migration that helped populate the American Midwest, a movement fueled not by dreams, but by desperation. In Europe, the story was the same. Food prices remained high. The fragile economies of war-ravaged nations struggled to recover. In Germany, famine sparked social reforms and early discussions about government responsibility for welfare and food distribution. In Ireland, the lingering effects of the cold, wet years further entrenched rural poverty, setting the stage for future tragedies like the Great Famine decades later. And in Asia, the aftermath of Tambora continued to unfold. The cholera pandemic, born amid the weakened, hungry populations of India, spread like wildfire along trade routes, carried by soldiers, merchants, and refugees. It would eventually kill millions and become a recurring specter in the 19th century, reshaping public health systems across the globe. Yet for all the devastation, human resilience endured. Communities rebuilt. Fields were replanted. Markets reopened. Scientific inquiry, too, found new momentum. Though the connection between Tambora's eruption and the global climate disruption wasn't fully understood at the time, curious minds began to ask deeper questions about the links between the atmosphere, volcanic activity, and the health of crops and communities. In a quiet way, the disaster accelerated the growth of meteorology, the study of weather, as a serious scientific discipline. Artists captured the strange skies in vivid paintings, their sunsets burned with otherworldly reds and purples, forever preserving the colors of a wounded atmosphere. Writers, like Mary Shelley and Lord Byron, shaped the literature of the Romantic period, infusing it with themes of apocalypse, nature's wrath, and human vulnerability. Even in suffering, creativity bloomed. And humanity, battered but unbroken, learned slowly that the world was bigger, wilder, and more interconnected than they had ever imagined. The year without a summer was not simply a historical oddity. It was a pivotal moment, a reminder that even the mightiest empires and the most advanced societies were still at the mercy of forces far beyond their control. It was a year that humbled kings, scattered families, and seeded ideas that would change the course of nations. The sun had finally begun to shine again, But the memory of its absence would linger, in songs, in paintings, in stories whispered around fires on chilly nights, for generations to come. For decades after the year without a summer, people spoke of it in different ways. Some remembered it as a strange, cruel season, a time when the crops failed and the sun refused to shine. Others wove it into folklore, tales of ghostly winters, angry gods, and punishment from the heavens. In towns and villages across Europe and America, older generations would tell wide-eyed children about the summer when snow fell on their gardens and hunger knocked at every door. But slowly, the story moved from myth into science. By the mid-19th century, scholars began connecting the dots. Careful observers noticed that major volcanic eruptions seemed to precede periods of strange weather. The eruption of Mount Tambora in 1815, though distant and initially obscure to many in the West, was increasingly recognized as the starting point of the global climate anomaly. In 1850, scientists formally began discussing the idea that volcanic eruptions could inject sulfur particles into the upper atmosphere, reflecting sunlight and cooling the Earth's surface. Later studies would confirm it. Tambora had thrown millions of tons of dust and gas into the stratosphere, enough to lower global temperatures by 1 to 2 degrees Celsius for several years. Today, we know that even a seemingly small temperature drop on a global scale can trigger massive disruptions, shortened growing seasons, food shortages, shifts in ocean currents, and widespread famine. Tambora taught humanity a crucial lesson: the world's systems are delicate. One event in one corner of the globe can ripple outward, touching continents and civilizations thousands of miles away. It also hinted at something deeper, something many scientists and philosophers would wrestle with over the next 2 centuries. That despite all our achievements, despite cities, armies, inventions, and wealth, we remain profoundly vulnerable to the forces of nature. In the years following the eruption, new fields of study blossomed. Meteorology grew from simple weather observation into a more rigorous science, seeking to understand and predict the complex patterns of air and sea. Volcanology developed, driven by the need to study and monitor the Earth's restless interior. Public health reforms, food storage innovations, and agricultural diversification strategies all grew, shaped by the hard lessons of famine and disease. Mount Tambora's eruption, and the year without a summer that followed, had shaken the world awake. Not just to the power of nature's fury, but to the reality that survival often depends not on strength or wealth alone, but on preparation, adaptability, and understanding. It was a humbling revelation, one that still resonates today, in an era where humanity faces new challenges from climate change, natural disasters, and shifting environments. The ash clouds of Tambora may have long since settled, but the questions they raised, about our place in the natural world, about our vulnerabilities, and about the ties that bind us across nations and oceans, are still with us. We carry the memory of that strange, dark summer not just as history, but as a warning. A reminder that the Earth is alive. That change can come suddenly, without warning. And that no matter how powerful we become, we are always, at our core, part of the same fragile world. The skies eventually cleared. The ash slowly settled, drifting invisibly down through the layers of atmosphere, washing away with rain, sinking into soil, vanishing into forgotten corners of the earth. By 1818, most of the world had returned to something like normal. Crops grew again. Summers warmed. Markets reopened. Children played in green fields no longer haunted by frost and famine. But the year without a summer had left a mark that went deeper than the seasons. In New England, the Great Migration westward continued, reshaping the American frontier and fueling the spirit of expansion that would define a generation. In Europe, memories of hunger drove governments to rethink food security, public health, and rural policies. In Asia, the shock of famine and disease laid bare vulnerabilities in trade routes and urban centers, vulnerabilities that would shape future revolutions and reforms. And everywhere, the eruption of Mount Tambora lingered, not just in history books, but in the very way humanity thought about the world. For the first time, people began to understand that they lived on a planet where distant forces, unseen volcanoes, shifting winds, vast oceans, could change their lives overnight. That realization brought a new kind of fear. But it also brought a new kind of wonder. The knowledge that the Earth was one interconnected system, that what happened on a remote island in Indonesia could shape sunsets in Switzerland and snowfall in Vermont, planted the seeds for a new, global understanding of science, weather, and our shared destiny. The story of Tambora and the Year Without a Summer is not just a story of disaster. It is a story of resilience. Of human beings struggling to survive in a world they could not control, adapting, migrating, creating, and imagining their way through a time of darkness. It gave birth to legends, to new faiths, to haunting works of art and literature. It redrew maps, redefined communities, and reshaped economies. It showed, in the clearest possible terms, that no nation, no empire, no city stands alone. We are all bound together by the thin, fragile atmosphere above us. By the rains that fall and the seeds that grow. By the silent, sleeping giants beneath our feet, mountains that one day may awaken and remind us, once again, of our place in the grand, unpredictable story of the earth. Today, Mount Tambora stands still, its broken peak a jagged reminder of its ancient fury. The villagers who live around it tend their fields and watch the seasons carefully. They know, as we should all know, that nature remembers even when we forget. The year without a summer ended. But the lesson endures. That even in the face of darkness, humanity finds ways to adapt, to endure, and to hope for the return of the sun. And that was the story of the Year Without a Summer, a moment when the world was humbled by nature's unseen hand, and humanity was forced to adapt, survive, and rethink its place in a changing world. If you enjoyed this journey through history, please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this story surprised you the most? We'd love to hear. Thank you for being with us tonight. Stay curious, stay thoughtful, and we'll see you in the next story.